and the environment. As a continuing lecturer at Berkeley and as a provost and professor at the Presidio Graduate School, his courses, which include Engineering, the Environment and Society, Engineering Social Justice, and Global Poverty, Challenges and Hopes, have resulted in numerous teaching and service awards, including UC Berkeley's most prestigious award for teaching, the 2017 Distinguished Teaching Award was awarded to Khalid. And I believe it was also in 2017 when I first met Khalid while I was a postdoc at Berkeley. I'd heard about him and sat in on the Engineering Social Justice class, which I sat on the floor because it was full to capacity, and I stole the syllabus. And me and my friends formed a mini brunch and social justice book club based on the syllabus from Khalid's class. So I'm so happy we could have him here to share just a portion of that with you today. So Khalid, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you for that, Jess. Super stoked to be here. Really excited to have a conversation about this. I'm gonna try to cover a lot, probably more than one should try to cover in 50 minutes. I'm letting myself off the hook because it's recorded. So you're like, if he said that too fast, I can like go back and re-listen to it slower. And also because I wanna get to the end because I wanna have a conversation. So I wanna start with one of my sort of favorite quotes. When someone says they have no politics, it means that their politics align with the status quo. And I think that's a really valuable sort of starting point. It's written by journalist George Monbiot, and he continues onward and he says, objectivity is impossible. And for a journalist, that's a pretty stark thing, right? They're supposed to be objective and neutral and all of this. And he's like, there's no such thing. And he's pushing journalists to sort of own their perspective and own that they have an angle. And at the root of much of what I want to do today is a similar thing when we think about engineers. I want us to own that we have a perspective and an angle, and other people have other perspectives and other angles, and to sort of speak to what the value might be to make space for those other angles. Another way to put it is you can't stand still on a moving train. So this is an image that perhaps some of you have seen before. John Gast, 1872. It's called American Progress. It's a painting to represent manifest destiny, American westward expansion, and I think it really covers a lot of the things that we take for granted. In this painting, you see technology as an image of progress. On the left side, you see sort of natives leaving the picture and it's dark, and then you see colonial settlers replacing the spaces that they used to live in, and then you see railroads and telegraph off to the right, the sort of coming of technology. And in her hand is a book. This is Columbia, and in her hand is a book, Common School, representing educational enlightenment. And the essence of the Western idea of progress, to quote Robert Nisbet, can simply be stated: mankind has advanced in the past, is now advancing, and may be expected to continue advancing in the future. But what, it will be asked, does advance mean? And I think often in engineering, we approach our technological development in this, like, we're excited about it. If you're anything like me, you're definitely excited about it, and we geek out about it. We use that language. And yet there's this presumption of, at best, value neutrality, at what I would say worse, this idea that technology equals progress. And I think that's one of the embedded assumptions that I want us to question. So to do that, I'm gonna carry us starting through a little bit of something that we all know much more about. And given all the news that's causing anxiety right now, maybe you don't want to hear about climate change in this moment, but bear with me, I'll keep it short. The world's getting warmer, we know that. It's gone up about 3/4 degrees Celsius in the last 100 years. We're consistently exceeding our own expectations of how much greenhouse gas emissions are going up. The pandemic did dent emissions, but only slightly. We're back up to pre-pandemic levels now, despite still being in the pandemic. And for 2020, we're looking at about a 5% increase or decrease in overall emissions from 2019. Now we're like, okay, 5% decrease, that sounds good, except we're still higher than 2018. So even with the pandemic, we're still beating out 2018 greenhouse gas emissions. And as a result of this warming of the Earth, we see problems up in the Arctic. The Arctic's kind of a bellwether because the poles are warming more quickly than the equator. Shrinking ice sheets on land contribute to sea level rise. On the left here, we're looking at the Arctic sea ice extent from 1981 to 2010. And there's the sort of interdecile range shown in some of that gray. And then the important one here to look at, the important two are the dotted red line is 2012. That's the worst ever. That's the lowest area of the Arctic that was ever covered in ice. And 2020, you can see, is not too far off from there. On the right, we're looking at the volume. So the left is the extent of coverage. On the right, we're looking at the total volume. And you can sort of see the trajectory here, 1990s to the 2000s to 2010s. And now we're looking at 2020 as one of the worst 3 years ever. To add to that, another way of looking what's happening in the Arctic, here we're looking at the coverage of sea ice. The higher the concentration of sea ice, the whiter the image is, and lower concentration appears blue. And this is the extent of the area covered by at least 15% sea ice. And the yellow line is the median from 1981 to 2010. So that's not like the maximum, that's the median. Half the years in this 30-year period were greater, half were less, and you can sort of see where we are now. We're looking at, possibly 1 meter of sea level rise by 2100, and that's a relatively conservative estimate. Some argue it may be far more, depending on all the uncertainties wrapped up in these estimations. But 1 meter of sea level rise means hundreds of millions of people forced to move. And this is 2100. This is in like the next generation's lifespan, to say the least. So we're thinking about hundreds of millions of people having to migrate in that time. It's not just sea ice, warming is not the only thing happening. We see heat accelerating the hydrological cycle, and this is sort of an elegant way of demonstrating the sort of massive increase in the number of floods by decade on each continent represented here. Not each continent, the Americas are put together, but you get the idea. There are more and more floods. And the ocean is often sort of not looked at in more popular press discussions, but CO2 has a really big effect when it dissolves in the ocean. We all know the chemistry of CO2. Coral reefs in particular are very likely to be extinct within our lifetime because they can only tolerate a narrow window of temperature and acidity conditions, and reefs are the nurseries for many of our fisheries. Plankton are dying or moving, dramatically changing ocean ecosystems. So there's all of this doom and gloom, but you know what? Don't worry about it. We got this covered. And I'm not trying to pick on Project Drawdown here, but I'm going to dig a little bit because I think that they very much exemplify the problem that I want to unpack a little bit today. They saw a problem. They saw that the Earth is getting warmer. They rolled up their sleeves and they started to figure it out. How can we stop that from happening? How can we fix this problem? In the process, they've got a huge movement built around what they believe will save the planet and the human species. And I want to challenge their approach because I think it's wrong. I think it stems from a kind of blindness that is mixed together with a bit of savior attitude that's usually more about the savior than the things that they're saving. And in fact, I think it's worse than just wrong. I actually think that there's a great injustice in this approach. This approach misidentifies the problem. And in doing so, the proposed solutions not only fall short, but in fact, they reinforce the root issue that led to this problem in the first place. So that's a little bit of introduction of where I'm going to try to go, and I'll come back to climate change when we think about injustice. But to start, I want to give a little bit of theoretical background and talk about some of the ideologies embedded within engineering. This will be pulling off other people's work, not my own, a little bit of both actually. And then thinking about climate and what might it mean to look at a story of climate change through a justice-based angle. And then to step back and think, what might it mean for us to move from trying to do socially good work to socially just work? And then a little bit about what I've been up to at UC Berkeley that I was asked to share. So to start, I want to think about engineering ideologies. And in particular, I want to think about this idea that I'm pulling from Tanya Lee. It's known as rendering technical. So Aaron Ketch, a scholar now at University of Michigan, writes that we have a culture of disengagement in engineering. Disengagement from issues of public concern or public good. In fact, in her research, she found that as students move through engineering programs in the United States, their concern for social issues actually decreases. And for those of you who are educators on this call, I think it's worth sitting with this as engineering educators. Students come into our programs with some level of concern about social welfare and social good. By the time they get done with 4 years of our education, they have less concern with issues of social good and social welfare. So there's this question of like, what are we doing? Like, what is it about how we're teaching people that leading to this outcome? And Ketch identifies 3, what she calls ideological pillars to this culture of disengagement. The first is depoliticization, the belief that our work can and should be disconnected from social and political concerns, because otherwise we will be biasing our otherwise objective professional practice. So she notes that first, this conceals the inherently value-laden and social character of our work. We have these claims to objectivity and rationality as though we're somehow independent, but in reality, there's so many values and there's such a social character to the work we do, and it gets hidden in this process of depoliticization. And the simple example of that is like, how do we get funded? Like, obviously there are politics in funding because much of it's coming from the state. So, and it's not to get conspiratorial, but it's just to say that what gets studied and what doesn't is inherently a social and political process, and how we study it is rooted in that as well. The second part of this is that this ideology of depoliticization, it helps to frame social justice concerns, such as how our engineering work might make poverty worse, or might further marginalize disabled people, or might incorporate sexism and racism into the systems we create. It renders those questions as irrelevant to the work of engineering. This is the work of applying that engineering innovation later. It's not part of the engineering work itself. The second ideology that she pulls out is this dualism between the technical and the social. And she writes that engineering often devalues social competencies and devalues the ability to conceptualize the relationships between engineering work and public welfare. These are seen as sort of secondary importance and are not part of real engineering. And when you try to introduce things outside of the sort of textbook engineering curriculum, they're seen as soft skills, or they're seen as skills that are outside of engineering but useful for an engineer to have. It's almost like we don't own them. We don't see them as things that an engineer must know or must be engaged with. They're nice to have, but they're not core to our disciplines. And in fact, in many engineering institutions, we outsource these skills to other departments. We don't train them ourselves, we let other people train them because we see them as not part of what we do. This isn't simply a cognitive process, but within engineering cultures, Ketch identifies how this is seen as a moral imperative, that in fact it prescribes this as the right way to conduct engineering. And this issue is not unique to engineering. A number of scholars interested in higher education and, in fact, in education more broadly, have noted the increasing instrumentalization of education, the push to treat education as a process of learning a set of concrete skills, as opposed to education as a process of cultivating critical thinkers and engaged community members. But engineering is often seen as being very much at the forefront of this problem. The third pillar that she identifies, and one that I'm not going to spend as much time focusing on today, is the sort of this ideology of meritocracy. The idea that those who succeeded did so because of their hard work and dedication, and that's what got them where they are today. This belief denies the relationality of poverty, marginalization, and oppression, and I'm going to dive into that a little bit more later. Some are poor because other people are wealthy. Some are marginalized so that others can be centralized. And this is also a profoundly self-serving belief. For someone who's successful to put forward that they did it all on their own, it really it's almost narcissistic. So I want to consider, how do these ideologies show up in engineering practice? And the way I want to think about that is start by drawing something that, for those of you who are engineers on this call, should recognize as a control volume. It's a thing that we are asked to draw over and over and over again. We're trained to draw boxes, but and this isn't some conspiratorial thing. It's a thing that we're trained to do in order to carefully define a problem by putting a control volume around it, and then the problems coming in and the solutions coming out. And if it was an air conditioner inside, you'd have hot air coming in. That's the problem. You'd have cold air coming out. And inside is where you do the cooling of the air. In this process of drawing control volumes, it's part of a way of making problems technical and describing the problem, the solution, all in technical terms. And we're sort of in the process of creating a control volume. We're implicitly saying that anything we're not including in here is not related. So all of the outside world is not part of the way we're approaching this problem. And this is just a routine technical process. Now, the concern I have with this process is, firstly, obviously, we draw boxes around problems, but these boxes, and we do that to simplify them. It's a sort of a rational thing to do, but the problem is these boxes exclude. The problems are not addressed, but instead we're addressing symptoms of problems. And this is what Tanya Lee refers to as rendering technical. And it's premised on Aaron Ketch's technical social dualism, one that involves the depoliticization of problems, as well as the decontextualization of problems. Taking problems as though the context doesn't matter, they're this abstract theoretical thing that then we can drop down into different contexts anytime we want. And in this process, human beings and social categories are reduced to simply clients or users or intervention targets. And in this way, we might go so far as to say it's an almost dehumanizing process when we treat human problems as these abstract technical things that exist outside of human context. So we exclude history from the problems. We exclude the specific context. We exclude relationships of power. And I think the most insidious part is that we exclude ourselves. We draw ourselves outside of the boxes, and that covers up the ways in which we ourselves are connected to the very problems that we're trying to address. So if we're trying to address a structural engineering problem relating to housing where we live, we leave ourselves as when we design solutions to the housing problems and we are engaged in sort of our standard engineering practice, we're not invited to think about, well, what is our role in the larger system of housing in the place where we live? And why is it that housing is so expensive? Why is it that we have housing problems? Like, we're not invited to make that part of the conversation, and we reduce the conversation to just questions about stress and strain and building strength and whatnot. And we divorce it from the context of housing, people's lived experience of housing. And you can apply this to so many other sort of engineering issues. The results of our boxes is that our innovative solutions are inevitably lacking and inevitably incomplete. And often they'll end up reinforcing structures of marginalization and oppression. So the question that immediately comes up, well, can't we do engineering for good? Can we just do engineering in ways that target good or positive outcomes? Sure, I think that's absolutely important. But I worry that in the process, we're only ever going to address the symptoms of the problems we're concerned about. In so much as problems are tied to context, history, power, technological fixes are simply going to work around those real issues. We will never stop the constant reproduction of the problem whose symptoms we're trying to address. And so instead, I think we need to rethink our orientation to engineering. And to do this, I want to lean on a quote. A couple of years ago, there was an excellent op-ed in the New York Times by Casey Gerald. In it, he describes how he was the poster child for the American dream. A Black child born into poverty, played football at Yale, went on to work at Wall Street, and then in the Obama administration. And he was held up as being like, this is proof that the American dream is real, that the American dream really works. But he came to see that he is not a symbol of the American dream. Instead, he sees his story as the exception, not the rule. And towards the end of the piece, he has this really beautiful line. We need to stop substituting hopeful stories for justice. And I think sitting with that and thinking about there's tension in here, because I love to brag about the awesome, cool projects my students do. But these one-off cool projects are often just hopeful stories that are not addressing the systemic issue that resulted in that problem in the first place. And I think we often lean on hopeful stories and we don't talk about justice. So I'm going to argue that while engineering for good is no doubt important and valuable, and it may bring us stories of hope in specific cases of individualized success, engineering for good falls short. Instead, I want to argue in the spirit of Gerald's piece that we need to move towards engineering for justice, and specifically engineering for social justice. So if we take that approach and we think about climate change in another way, we can think about climate change not as an issue of greenhouse gas, but instead we can think about climate change as a social justice issue. Sure, it has technical manifestations, but more importantly, it has human manifestations. And in our efforts to tackle this problem, I think we need to start with the human side of it. And I think that would lead to us trying to solve it very differently. Now, I'm not going to give you a complete picture of climate justice, and I hope most of you are already well familiar with the kinds of things I'm going to bring up, but I'm going to try to give you a window into the human side of the issue, and then consider how we might change the way we think about our work to address this sort of pressing issue of climate change. So, here we're looking at CO2 emissions, and this is production-based emissions. Number 1 is China, number 2 is the US, number 3 is India. If you were China, you probably wouldn't be happy about this because if you're the US, you're really happy that it's based on production, not consumption. If it's consumption-based emissions, the US is still by far number 1 per capita. We've just outsourced our emissions by producing the things we consume in other places. The other problem with this kind of image is that it's ahistorical. It doesn't acknowledge the different levels of development and the different levels of sort of wealth and the challenges faced by poor nations and the lack of resources available to them. So this is both ahistorical and a certain angle. And I share this image not just to hate on it, because I actually think it's really valuable, but I share it so that we can remember that we have to take these images and take them in a critical vein. And by critical, I don't mean disliking them. I mean understanding what they are and what they aren't. This issue of numeracy. So when we think about climate change, we want to think about it in a justice-based perspective. A common approach is to think about responsibility and harm, like who's responsible and who's being impacted. So this is a cartogram comparing cumulative CO2 emissions by country from 1950 to 2000. And this is basically the size of debt each country owes for using more than its fair share of CO2 in the atmosphere. So note that this is by country. Per capita emissions are going to be even more unequal. It doesn't adjust for the population inside of any country. But this gives you a sense of who has contributed to this problem. And it's not a surprising cartogram for any of us. We know very well where the problems originate. But I think the more difficult side is the second image that these authors bring forward. This image is the regional distribution of 4 climate-sensitive health effects: malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and inland flood-related fatalities. So they're only looking at deaths that they can attribute directly to climate change from these 4 causes, not all the other things that climate change is causing a problem. And now you really see the stark comparison. You see the difference between the image above, responsibility, and the image below, unequal impacts. And it changes the way we think about climate change, at least changes the way I think about climate change, because I can't even identify where we are right now on this map because it's so tiny. The effects on us are so much smaller, and yet you see who's really bearing the brunt of this. And I think it gets us to think about climate and ask different questions about climate. If we look at the IPCC's 5th assessment report, we see that, and this is, by the way, this is consensus-based language. So it's important to remember that by the time the IPCC gets it down, approves it, it moves out there. This is because like everyone's like more or less, okay, this is the way this is. It's not some radical cutting edge perspective. And they acknowledge very explicitly that marginalized groups are especially vulnerable to climate change, and that this is a product of intersecting social processes. where socioeconomic status and income and exposure, these things all come together. Gender, class, ethnicity, age, disability, ability, all of these come together to mean that the way in which climate is experienced is very much dependent on your social position, and that those who are in sort of weaker social positions relative to those who are in stronger are the ones who are going to get hurt by this. And I think this is sort of a moment for us to take this and think, okay, if we're going to take this seriously, how are we going to approach climate differently, knowing that some people are getting hurt more than others and some people are causing it more than others. And here we see the consequences, just some images. On the top left is one of my favorite, when Dr. Ibrahim Didi, the Prime Minister of the Maldives, held a cabinet meeting underwater. And he was like, this is the future for us. Like, this is where my cabinet meetings are going to be. And it's sort of, you know, it's a PR thing, but it's real, you know, and subsistence peoples and the struggles they're having, Arctic peoples, those that rely on fisheries, rain-fed and glacial-fed agriculture. This image is from Peru here. Thinking about the sort of different challenges that groups who often don't have a seat at our tables and don't have like a front seat when we think about climate change are struggling with. In addition, there's a lot of sort of association between climate and conflict. And this is, of course, like an area of great debate. How much of conflict is attributable to climate change? But there are a lot of cases that the Darfur conflict was the first sort of real climate kicked off conflict. There are a lot of evidence and a lot of debate around Syria, and arguing that Syria is a direct result of drought and climate effects. And so in a paper from here at UC Berkeley, Rachel Murillo-Frosch and some of her co-authors have articulated what they call the climate gap. How in the United States, people of color and the poor suffer first from higher mortality and health impacts due to climate change. They have greater exposure from natural disasters. They experience more harmful effects from intense heat waves. There are disparities in the climate-sensitive infectious diseases over who's exposed to them, who's not. The current patterns of air pollution and health inequality are likely to worsen for people of color and poor people. They also see that there's a major spending gap here, that people of color and poor people pay a greater cost for basic necessities. And as climate change keeps happening, this gap is going to become greater and greater. Those of us who have more wealth are going to see the difference between what we spend to stay warm versus what poor people spend to stay warm or to stay cool, depending on where you live in the season, that this is going to increase. And the result is that the capacity for poor folks and folks of color to absorb or be resilient through climate shock is decreased. And third, they point out that poor folks and folks of color in the United States are experiencing reduced economic opportunities. They're shifting job opportunities, greater job losses. So they're sort of making this case that climate change is a race issue. Climate change is a poverty issue. And if we're not talking about race and poverty, we're not fully talking about climate change. And if there was anywhere that really made this case more clearly, I think it's New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina. Neil Smith has a famous article, "There's No Such Thing as a Natural Disaster." And in it, he writes, "In every phase and every aspect of a disaster, causes, vulnerability, preparedness, results, response, and reconstruction, the contours of the disaster and the difference between who lives and who dies is to a greater or lesser extent a social calculus. It's not about how big the storm was. It's not about how big the waves were. It's a social calculus. And it's the preconditions that were already set up." And he goes on, he writes, "The final lesson of environmental geography concerning disasters is that far from flattening social differences," we use this language around natural disasters as though we're all in this together. It's a natural disaster, we're all in together. He writes, "It's far from flattening social differences. Disaster reconstruction invariably cuts deeper the ruts and grooves of social oppression and exploitation." So in this, I'm trying to make the case that climate change is not a technical problem. Climate change is not a problem of carbon dioxide or methane. It's not a problem of rainfall and drought. It's not a problem of temperature. These are merely the physical manifestations of our social and political relationships. Climate change is a result of social injustice, of oppression, and of the dominance and supremacy of some people over others. It's a direct outcome of a system in which wealthy, primarily Western, and primarily white lives, priorities, comforts, perspectives, beliefs, desires, these are prioritized and valued at the ongoing expense of the bodies of poor people and people of color. And I want to be clear here, climate change is not just about privilege. It's about oppression and dominance, and it's about supremacy. The dominance of some people and some people's lives and some people's priorities over other people. It's not privilege when the benefits that I accrue happen at the expense of someone else. That's a form of my supremacy over someone else. And so I don't think we're going to solve the problem of oppression and dominance with a technical solution, the development of which provides those of us like myself who are at the center of the problem with well-paid jobs to go about fixing it. So hopefully I've made you a little uncomfortable now, and I want to think about how we might go about doing differently and what are some approaches that we might move from social good to social justice. First, theoretically, then a slide on how to apply this to climate, and then a little bit more. So I think the things we need to do to move from thinking about doing good to doing right, from social good to social justice, is to start by thinking about history, to rectify historical injustices, to make explicit attempts to make up for past practices that have resulted in the current forms of inequity we see. This opens space for conversations around reparations or affirmative action to rectify historical trajectories based upon past injustices. The second thing that I think we can do is to recognize, to name, to identify, to point out the relationality of marginalization and oppression. And this is a social scientific concept. The idea is that poverty is not some mistake on the way to some collective utopia. Poverty is a result of the systems and processes in the world we live in. It is produced and reproduced by the way we have socially and politically constructed the world. So to think about poverty and marginalization as connected to wealth and power, to think about these two as the same. And a common example I use when I'm speaking with my students is, and it's a little tricky when we're on in Zoom University, but is to say, you know, when we walked into the classroom, the chalkboards were clear and the trash cans were empty. And when we left, we put stuff in them and we wrote stuff on the board. And then when we come back the next day, they're empty and clear again. In the middle of the night, somebody comes in here and cleans this place up after us. And they're literally rendered invisible because it happens when we're not even there. And to think about like our ability to have a nice clean classroom every time we walk in is related to someone else's being hired to come in and clean that. But on what terms? What are they paid? And what hours are they forced to work? And how are they treated by their employer? And thinking about the different status that exists for different people inside of our universities. And what do our janitors get paid? And do we see them as part of the university community? Or do we see them some sort of outsourced labor that comes in when we're not around to clean up after us? And so thinking about how these things are in relation to one another, and they're wrapped up in our budget. And so to recognize that our own comforts are often tied to other people's discomforts, that these two are not separate from one another. The third piece of moving from social good to social justice is to think about whose voices matter, and to think about how we might center the voices, create more spaces where marginalized voices are at the front of our tables, and they're the ones who are driving the conversations. Now, doing this in the context of engineering is going to be very tricky for two reasons. And I'm going to use some words I'll define them, I promise, maybe poorly. I think embedding these concerns within engineering is going to require an epistemological transformation. Epistemology is about how do you know what you know? What are the methods you use to understand the world, to produce knowledge? How is knowledge created and established? This within engineering, to bring in justice-based concerns, is going to have to take us beyond the sort of quantitative, empirical, what are called positivist methods, the methods that dominate engineering work today. And it's going to require us to accept and embrace other methods of knowledge production in our theses, in our papers, in our research. This is not easy because we're trained in using certain methods to understand the world, and we understand these as being the best methods to use. And I think we need to step back and say there are other methods that may be equally valid or better. And that is going to be a big uphill battle. because of the sort of dominance of a certain way of understanding truth within engineering. And it's not just that it requires this epistemological transformation, it also will have a lot of practical implications. As a result, I think we'll be asking very different research questions and new research questions. We will obviously take on different research methods. It will require us to change our curricula, to add new courses, to change the way we teach our current courses. And it will require us to change how and where we do our engineering work, who we work for, who we are ultimately accountable to for our work. So let me try to make this a little more pragmatic. That's the broader perspective. How would this look in the case of climate change? Well, in the case of history, we might just ask historical questions. Why do we have this problem? How did we end up with the problem of climate change? Let's look backwards and see how this came to be. Where did it come from? Who did it come from? And what ideologies underpinned the actions that brought about global climate change? And in this, you know, your geographer would tell you, well, that's about modernization, this ideology of progress, the push for industrialization. All of these lie at the root of contemporary engineering, and all of these lie at the root of climate change too. If we want to think about the relationality of marginalization of oppression, we can just ask, where are we positioned relative to these questions? Who benefits from actions that cause climate change? I personally benefit. My parents live in another country. I can get on a plane and fly over to them, and not having to pay the full carbon cost of that enables me to benefit from getting on a plane and flying over there when someone else, most likely in another country, is at the forefront of the effects of that carbon. And so thinking about where are we positioned relative to the benefits and the harms that result in climate change. And finally, thinking about centering marginalized voices, who's at our tables? Or who's presenting in our Zoom rooms when we talk about addressing climate change? And why is it that economically, racially, geographically, the same groups that hold the most responsibility for the problem are the ones who have positioned themselves as the dominant voices for how we should go about dealing with the problem? There's like an ethical problem in that, right? The people who cause the problem are the ones that are getting to decide how we fix it. And how might we go about changing that? And this gets at this question, like, who gets to design the future? And for whom do they get to do that? So if we want to move towards a sort of more socially just approach to engineering, I think there's some, at the root of it, it's about asking questions. And I think here are a few questions that I personally find valuable. What motivates me? What motivates my work when I take on a project? Is there some private market demand? Is there some ideology about progress and about how innovation is going to make things better? And have I questioned whether this specific innovation is going to make things better? And if so, for whom is it going to make it better? And at what cost? Whose needs and priorities are being valued and prioritized? Or are my efforts being put forward based around principles of justice? Is that's what's driving me to do this work? And then we may also sort of ask, to whom are we accountable? What responsibility do we have for the systems we take part in? And so often in engineering ethics, we take a very micro ethics approach. We take this approach of like, you know, should we report to our boss over our boss's head if we think there's a problem? It's like everyone, the NASA example is a common example in ethics classes. And it's like, can we think about larger social injustices around us and not just think about what happens in our day-to-day interactions and are they ethical, but what about our larger social position? And what are the ethics implied by being in that social position? And can we move beyond a narrowly construed set of professional ethical guidelines? And how might we expand these and set higher standards for ourselves and for our colleagues to take on many of the sort of justice-based concerns facing the world today? So in this process, I think we need to reframe what it means to be an engineer. And of course, those who are a traditional engineer are most likely they're gonna have a reason, if they aren't already, to be opposed to this. Because now, whatever they qualify, whatever they count as what it means to be a real engineer, we're now saying we need to redefine that. And you might have to do something new to become a real engineer if that's what you want to be. The first is to think about being a critical engineer. And by, again, critical doesn't mean negative. Critical means like we critique Shakespeare. We take it apart to understand like what's going on in this play or poem or sonnet or whatever. Critical engineer means recognizing the limits of our instrumental professional training and the limits of just having good intention and embracing and engaging in critique that goes beyond the technical. Considering how we might render the problems we're tasked to address as political. redraw our control volumes, and instead draw systems diagrams. Bring power, bring history, bring context into the frame to expand the sorts of solutions that are possible. I think on a more personal level, we can rethink our professional identities. We're more, we're not just a wrench. You don't like call for the engineer when you got to tighten the thing down, right? Like that's not all we are. Although sometimes we even embrace this. We have political positions in relation to the projects that we do and in relation to the communities that we work with. The identity of engineer doesn't capture all that we are. We're community members. You might be a voter. You might be a neighbor. You might be a consumer. Key point is that we're not outsiders, but we're rather related in very complicated ways to the issues that we're trying to address. So recognizing that our personal lives are political too. And to that end, we also have more to offer than simply a narrow set of professional expertise. You're not just a hydrologist, you're also a person. And maybe you're a good cook, or maybe you can paint, or who knows what else you can do, but you offer more to the world than your identity as an engineer. And I think we need to invite that into engineering practice. And finally, and perhaps the trickiest one, I think we need to start thinking about social injustice not as a set of discrete problems that we can go out and solve, like some whack-a-mole issue. Then instead, we need to think about how might we cultivate sustained long-term engagement with the communities around us. As opposed to narrow technical project consulting, a different sort of commitment, not the drop-in type of engagement, but something that requires a broader conception of our own professional praxis and a broader framing of what it means to be an engineer, and see engineering as rooted in being a community member. So that still keeps us in a little bit of the theoretical, and now I want to share a bit of what I've been doing at UC Berkeley, and I want to describe two programs that I teach in to give you a sense of some of the attempts at a pedagogically different approach. One program is not engineering specific. It's an interdisciplinary program focused on poverty action. The other is rooted in engineering. And let me preface this by saying that I've been involved in teaching in these, but none of this is just my own work. And if what I've said before doesn't make that clear, I don't think much of what we do is our own work. It's always built upon the shoulders of others. And I want to acknowledge, I think maybe one or two of those others are in the room. I won't embarrass you by naming you right now, but I just want to say that this is part of a larger process that has led to this, not just my work. The first program that I want to talk about is this Global Poverty in Practice program. And I want to give you a quick sense of the program sequence because I think it's important. I think it's important to understand the sequencing of the program to understand what we're trying to do in this program. You take some really big survey course on poverty. You get to understand what are the debates, how are different academics understanding it, what are the ways people are addressing it, where did it come from, who has it, how is it related to inequality. Next, once you enter into the minor, it's a minor at UC Berkeley, you take a course with this really wonky name that gets you ready for field work. And you deal with some of the ethical challenge of going into someone else's neighborhood and trying to fix their poverty problem. You think about the methods of poverty alleviation that are common, and you learn how to sort of first touch and how to do some of those methods. And you deal with some of the pragmatic issues that students often run into. At the same time, you take two courses. One, focusing on the sector that you're entering into. So if you're going to work on homelessness in San Francisco, you might take a class that deals with approaches to housing and homelessness. So you start learning about what are all the ways people are trying to deal with this. And you also take a course on global and area studies. So your other course might be about the history and context of San Francisco. What is this place? How did San Francisco come to be? So there's sort of two planes that you're getting. You're getting the sort of context and history of the place, and you're getting the different ways people intervene. Then you go out and you do what we call a practice experience. And it's a strange word, a strange phrase. Instead of calling it a service learning thing, we take the word service out of it. This is a practice experience. You're an undergraduate student. You're going to go get some practice and learn from this. We're trying to drop the presumption that we're fixing the world in our summer internship. And so you go out and you do your practice experience. And I think crucial to this program is you come back and you take a full semester course focused on critical reflection. And in this course, you really sort of think through all of the ideas that you engaged with academically before, and you start to identify where and how did or didn't they show up in the work that I was actually doing this summer. And to me, this is where it really all sticks together, because you're how was this problem depoliticized in the way experts defined it? how did my own sort of race, class, gender, ability status shape the way I entered into this space and the way I saw it and the way I was seen? How, we start pushing students to think about where did the different theories of poverty alleviation, approaches to poverty action, where did or didn't they show up in this work, and how does that make you feel about it? Throughout this program, we have a number of sort of thematic priorities. One is sort of thinking about participation and the sort of strengths and pitfalls of different approaches to participation, thinking about poverty as a relational concept. So we never let our students get away with imagining that they're scientists looking down at something external to them, but we constantly force them to see their own place in the work that they're doing. We emphasize the way in which knowledge is not just something that exists, but it's something that is produced, and how it's produced, where it's produced, who produces has consequences. We think about expertise and the political nature of expert-based approaches, whether that's doctors or lawyers, public health practitioners or engineers. And we think about power and privilege. We think about oppression and marginalization. These all run through, and at some level, the center of this is really praxis. And I'm going to unpack what that means in a minute, but simply put, it's about this process of learning theory, acting in the world, and reflecting upon that action so that when you go back to act again, you act differently, so that you learn from your own work. And trying to build in, and you can see in the structure of the program, it's built around this idea of praxis, that it's iterative and it's about making one's professional career one of constant learning and iteration rather than just learning and then doing. The other program that perhaps is a little more relevant to engineering, and we have many engineers in the Global Poverty in Practice program, but this particular program is targeting engineers. It started in the fall of 2013, and the reason it started is because, to put it quite bluntly, UC Berkeley College of Engineering had and has a race problem. They have sort of really big problems with enrolling and supporting students from underrepresented groups. And this is not new to higher education. It's particularly bad in engineering. Some sections are worse than others. This was sort of where this program was born out of. And the general structure of the program is that it's meant to help make engineering, this is supposed to be on the supporting students once they're in, to help make engineering relevant to their own lives, to make it relevant to the communities they come from, to make it relevant to their own lived experience. They start with a cohort building seminar in the fall, and this cohort building seminar is actually especially important for underrepresented students who are often left out of study groups and activity groups and other classes. And it's a sort of broad, introductory, what are the pressing issues around social justice, and there are reading speakers, things like that. But at the same time, there's also a lot about like, how does this show up in your classrooms and how do you navigate UC Berkeley engineering as you're trying to make it through this space? Then they take my class, E157AC, which I'm gonna expand on in a minute. And then there's some funding available if they wanna do summer projects. So it's meant to sort of support them to learn a little bit about social justice and get situated in Berkeley and find support groups to take this course, and then to have funding to keep running with ideas that they learned on and they're interested in. So the course that I teach and that I developed with a lot of help it's called Engineering, Environment, and Society. Those commas are very important. The course deals with multiple racial categories in a comparative manner. And that's important because it's what they call at Berkeley an American Cultures course, that every student at UC Berkeley, every undergraduate has to take a course that deals with race in a comparative manner before they graduate. And so this course qualifies as that. Fundamentally, this course is a bridge between civil and environmental engineering and social justice, often through an environmental justice framework. Topics in the course include drinking water, stormwater, wastewater, natural waters, air pollution, infrastructure, waste disposal, everything from landfills to nuclear waste. We sort of dive into all of these projects from a justice-based perspective and think about how this has played out in the sort of world we live in. And particularly in US society, but even more so, it's even locally focused, because within the context of the course, and I think what makes it really special are we have 5 to 7 community partners every semester, and students do projects together with these partners. Half the students in the course complete these projects. They get 1 extra unit of credit, so it becomes a 5-unit course, so it's a big lift. And I require them to take the class for a grade because we're going to be working with external partners and I want to make sure they feel accountable for their work. And they spend much of their semester working on these projects that have been co-designed by the teaching team and the community partners. And the projects have to be related to engineering or technical work in some way. And so there's an opportunity here where what we're doing is we're getting students out of the classroom. And we're sort of asserting that you're not going to learn about these EJ issues just by studying them in class, but you can learn about them by working together with communities who have been marginalized in the Bay Area around problems that relate to the discipline you're studying right now. So making their engineering work sort of a lived reality. Together in these two programs, there are a number of sort of conceptual threads that tie them together. The first is a common focus on decentering the university as the site of knowledge production. The second is that social justice, broadly defined, serves as a foundation upon which all of the curricular work is undertaken. This shows up both in how we teach and in what we teach. By how we teach, I mean that we invite our students, their full selves, into the classroom. Not just you as a student to do this problem set, but you as a student who has siblings, who has responsibilities. This becomes part of the teaching process. And it's very different than sort of an expert-driven, skills-based approach. It's that the classroom gets co-created with students. Don't ask me how I'm going to do this over Zoom next semester. I'm still terrified. The third is that we take a systems thinking approach, recognizing that the problems we seek to address are embedded in complex dynamic systems, systems that are social and political in nature, and pushing students to map out those systems, understand the stakeholders who are involved and affected, and the power relationships between those stakeholders. Third, within both of these programs, relationality is woven through every single course. Students, teachers, professionals, community members are never treated as operating in separate spheres, but rather we strive to make visible the ways in which we're part of the worlds that we're studying and acting upon. And we work to identify, to name, and to engage with our own place in these systems. And finally, at the heart of these programs and courses is a deep commitment to praxis in that Freirean sense, that action that is committed to improving human well-being and that's not about enacting predetermined truths. Instead, it's not about theory or technology dropped onto the world, but instead it's about a deliberative, reflective action that is historically and culturally contingent. And the idea here is to bring a critical and yet actively engaged approach to our professional work. So with all of that, I'll conclude with a quote that I think is particularly important. And I'm kind of in shock that Dr. Martin Luther King said this in 1967. He said this over 50 years ago, and it's almost like the man could see beyond his time, because I feel like this is very much what we're struggling with now, that we need to move engineering away from being thing-oriented, away from being pipes and concrete-oriented, and move it towards being people-oriented. And he writes that when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, this is what you get. Racism, materialism, and militarism are going to run rampant. So my next question is, what's going to happen at UW? What are you all going to do differently? That's what I have for you.
Wow, thank you so much for that amazing talk. I hope there was something that Khalid said that you hold and sit with and engage with later on. So I'm going to try my best here to facilitate questions if anyone has some. If you want, you can drop it in the chat. I'll also be scrolling through the 143 folks on the call. If someone wants to raise their hand via the participants window, I can kind of call on you, I guess. And also, I would like to thank Steve and Sylvia Burgess for their endowed professorship that enabled this, this great talk and Khalid's visit. So, thank you. Okay.
Don't be shy. Ask questions ask the hard questions.
Britt, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you for such a great talk. So at the beginning of the talk, you talked about how engineers, we need to be more engaged with the community. But as with most issues, everything is very structural. And so I think like one of the barriers that like I immediately see as a researcher trying to address structural issues is the issue of funding, and having funding agencies see structural issues as academic issues. So like how can we bring about the change to that structure as researchers at a university?
So I'm primarily a teacher, so let me start with that. That's where I spend most of my energy. But I would say that there are already some real openings for this. Like the NSF is already very interested in, bringing engineering into communities and connecting. Some of it happens through K through 12 education for them, but some of it is very much like where's the community angle? Where are your partners that are beyond the university? So I feel like some of the momentum is there. But as researchers, I think getting on those NSF panels that evaluate those grants and say, hey, you know what, this is really interesting, but it seems totally disconnected from people. So maybe go back and do your homework and push. As soon as people start getting pushed that way, they'll respond and they'll be like, oh, I need to have this. One of the pitfalls that I'm finding, and there's this interesting thing that happens, is I get a lot of, I'm gonna be a little cynical here. I get a lot of emails from folks who are like, hey, we need a community-based perspective on this. Can you bring some of your work in here so we can get this NSF grant over here? And like, depending on who you are, I might say, okay, I like you and trust you, or I might be like, no, you need to do this work yourself. You can't just outsource it to me. I'll help you, I'll advise you on what you might do, but you need to own this work too, and not do the divide and conquer where you do the community piece and go out to the Central Valley and talk to people. I'm gonna stay in the lab and do this. I think we need to break that divide and conquer approach at some level. But that also requires us to, it's hard to support grad students to do that, because you want them in the lab cranking out those results, analyzing that data, and it's going to take time for them to get in a car and drive out to communities and sit with people and talk to people. So we have to grant them that time and that license to do that, I think. I hope that kind of addresses it a little bit.
Yeah, that addressed it. Thank you so much. I also have another question about the teaching sequences that you have. So I know within the context of Berkeley that a lot of diversity within the engineering department actually comes through transfer students who are not coming in as freshmen, but are coming in as juniors. Are they able to take the ESS sequence? And then the other question I have is, are you also capturing engineers in the chemical engineering department? Because they're not nested within the engineering department at the university. They're actually within the chemistry department.
That is a unique insight into Berkeley, the way in which chemical engineering is separate from the College of Engineering. I don't know if in the ES squared program, chemical engineers can be part of that. That I doubt, and that's definitely an administrative fail on that sense, but I don't know for sure. They can definitely be in the class, and we've had chemical engineers. We do have quite a number of transfer students who come into the ES squared program. One of the challenges is you have to, you get these postcards and whatnot, and you have to apply for the ES squared program before you show up on campus. So if it's not visible in all the overload of information you're getting, you might miss it. And once you're there, it's too late. So that poses a bit of a barrier for this. The class itself, about half the students who take 157 are from the ES squared program. The other half are sort of open. But I wanna point something out that if you live in a town and you're the only pizza place, it doesn't matter how bad your pizza is. People are going to come there to eat it, because people are just going to be like, okay, there's pizza, I can get it. This class is the only class like this. Every semester, I get upwards of 200, 250 people applying for 30 spots, because they're hungry for this. Students really want this, because everything they see around them is talking to them about this. And so there's a strong student-based demand for this kind of work. It does take more resources. For a class of 60 students, I have 2 graduate student instructors. One runs the projects, one teaches the students in the discussion section. This is a huge, managing 6 to 8 community projects is a lot of work, and so thinking about project managing that and helping students. I will say students learn so many ancillary things. They learn that the projects you're gonna do out in the quote real world, they're not scripted. There's not a discrete defined problem. They're open-ended, and you have to define those terms yourself. So I think there's a lot of benefits that come from that, but it does require resources to do.
Okay, thank you for addressing that.
Okay, so we have 2 questions that are also course related. The first is from Sarah. She says, do you ever bring in guest lectures from public health into your intro engineering courses? Because a lot of the climate change information could be covered in, say, environmental health 101. And then the other kind of course related question is how long and what was the process like to get these classes started?
The first question, I've never really seen engineering faculty bringing public health folks into their intro to engineering classes, but I think that that makes total sense. We definitely bring some public health related readings into 157. It's because I think you're totally nailing it, that these two are an intersection that come together real well. And usually it's the social determinants of health angle. In the global poverty and practice minor, probably a third of the students who take that program are public health students, because there is this obvious connection between those two. On the second question, if I remember right, was it like, what did it take to get this course up and going? Was that what it was? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
It took a fight, I won't deny, and it was the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion at the time who really fought to make this happen. There was enormous amount of resistance from within the College of Engineering when this first came online. They were concerned that being critical of engineering is dangerous because students might leave engineering. So in the first years of teaching the course, I had to prove that nobody's leaving engineering because they're learning to think critically about what they're doing. They're just learning to be better engineers. And now, after this is now going to be its 7th or 8th year, I'll be teaching it in the spring. It's offered once a year. The course is like bragged about by the university. Departments are literally fighting over who gets to own it. Like it's now flipped the conversation a little bit, which is great. But I will say that there was blood spilt in the beginning of this. And myself as a lecturer, adjunct faculty, there's some high risk in developing a course and going into this direction with this kind of thing. And I'm really grateful for all the people who helped support and make that happen. A lot of the support came out of the Division of Equity and Inclusion, thinking about how can we get into the curriculum and do something meaningful for our students.
Great, thanks. So another kind of two-part question for you. The first part comes from Emily. She asks, how can recent graduates or current college students challenge companies to focus on social justice and community building rather than capitalist gains? And then a kind of related question is, how do you maintain continuity and trust in the communities that you engage with?
Yeah, so that first one I think is a tricky question. And I think this is part of inviting students to form their own thoughts, beliefs, ideas about political economic systems. This isn't a political economy class. I teach one, and I think every undergraduate should have to take one, but I want to be careful to not, I have my critiques of capitalism, but the private sector is a huge part of engineering practice right now. And I think that understanding that that's where a lot gets done and a lot happens. And rather than drawing one black mark over everything, let's think about where the possibilities and weaknesses exist. I do give a lecture on political economy in that class, because often that's economics. When I was an engineer studying, the first thing I did when I decided I wanted to understand something beyond engineering is I went and took an economics of water class, because I thought that was going to get me to understand. And that was because I was familiar. It was numbers. I could do those. It wasn't a big deal. But then I realized that itself had the same problems. It was very much, economics is its own constructed discipline. So helping folks learn to have tools to start asking questions about the systems they're a part of is really important. That's liberal arts 101, right? That's what this is. And so can we help train engineering students with a liberal arts education maybe gets at that capitalism piece? And now with that answer, I forgot the second question.
The second question was, how do you maintain continuity and trust in the communities that you engage with?
Time. I go out to those communities when the course isn't on. I show up for things and it's amazing. I feel a little ashamed. The bar is so low with communities interacting with folks from UC Berkeley. You show up once, they'll talk about you for 3 years, that's that Berkeley person who showed up to that meeting, and it's over time you build, it's really about personal relationships, which also makes space to make mistakes. Sometimes a student says something racist with a community partner. How do we handle that? They could explode and blow up and be all angry, but they're okay, these are students, we'll work with this. It's not you, let's address it properly. It's about that trust and building that over time, but that really requires showing up. and it requires sort of putting that time in. And it's not an enormous amount of time. It's like, I'm going to make a trip out to the farm that they're running, or I'm going to show up at a community meeting they're having, you know, once a year, and that sort of ongoing relationship. And there's also often some of the partners, we usually work through nonprofit organizations. They want to partner up on they're like, hey, could you write a letter of support for this grant we're applying for? Sure, like absolutely, always saying yes to that stuff. Really easy stuff for me to do. And it shows them that I'm invested in them beyond what I get from them, so.
Okay, great. So I'm going to keep asking like two-part questions because we have so many
Go for it.
questions in the Q&A. Okay, so kind of related to that, how do we know which topics should be taught by, you know, faculty or engineering professors versus taught by others with expertise in these topics? And then a couple of questions with respect to, you know, how do we begin to shift this framework away from more fundamental engineering canon to the transformation that you were describing?
That's a hard question. It's a hard question in the abstract to think about like which topics land where. And so I think I'm more interested in process than end product. And I think that's that praxis piece, like to start down a road of engaging with potential partners in the pedagogical process, including students, including the people affected by the work, and to have, let me be clear about something. When we work in local communities, they want us to be damn good engineers. In that traditional sense, they're not interested in some half-baked engineer who like cares about them. They want a really good engineer who cares about them. So it's not like either or. So I don't think you'll find that community members like, no, drop that, you know, fluids class and instead spend all this time learning this. They're gonna be like, no, can we figure out ways to do both of these? Or what parts of the fluids class are important and aren't for the work we're interested in? So like, I think that making the answer to that question part of a collective conversation rather than coming up with the sort of curricular definition and rolling forward with it is part of that process, because it's going to show up differently in different projects. You know, if you're doing environmental, I have easy answers for you, but once you drop into mechanical engineering, yeah, maybe a little more complicated, right? So like, I think thinking about whose voices are at that curricular conversation is really important. And I missed the second half again, Jess.
It's okay, I'm hitting with tough questions. Kind of getting to how you shift the kind of institutional framework away from fundamental engineering towards the transformation you described.
I think you got to make tenured faculty feel safe. I think that's really important, because if they don't feel safe, they're going to fight for the things that they already know. And there's an irony there, because they're the ones with tenure, right? All due respect, not calling on anybody, but just saying that like we've got to be able to let go of some of the things that we have been taught are important. And we have to be able to critically ask, do we still think they are important? Are they important in the context we're in? And can we like bring other things into the conversation? And that requires giving up some of the things that we might think are important. So I think that's really at the start of it, is you've got to, because the faculty own the curriculum, and as they should. And so I think like helping faculty think about who else should be involved in this process and helping them feel safe and letting go of some of the things that they may have traditionally taught, and supporting them through that process. If I'm going to ask you to change up your course, I'm not just going to be like, oh, it's November, why don't you get that ready for spring? I'm like, no, let's get you a GSR for a semester to rethink these things. Let's support you in that process rather than just drop it on you. So, and I think we also got to think about which faculty we're talking about, whether we're talking about junior faculty, senior faculty, adjuncts, tenure track, like all of that plays. We've got to be attentive to the dynamics of the institutions we're in. So.
Great, thanks. This next question comes from Carson. He asks, how about the role of science communication doing a better job getting research results out to the general public, engaging in discussions about how engineering is impacting people, et cetera?
I think that's like so important. Science communication is super important. And I think though that for me, science communication isn't about helping people learn the facts that we discover in science. It's about helping people, inviting them into the making of the science so that they understand why we believe the facts we believe, right? Like even when I teach undergraduates at Berkeley, I have to regularly, repeatedly explain what peer review is, why it exists, what it's all about. The general public isn't going to have access to that information. And so why should they believe some scientific fact that you discovered as opposed to something else someone else tweeted about on Twitter, right? So like inviting people into like, what is it that leads us to having confidence in science? And what are the limits? What are the weaknesses? So that we can be honest that science doesn't equal truth. And science is constantly under production and reproduction. And as scientists, we spend so much of our lives like trying to build upon what others have done and refute what others have done, because science is always under sort of in a moving target. And so helping bring people into that, and I think that's sort of treating them as adults and as intellectuals is what I'm getting at here, but helping them understand what science is and what it isn't. The other side of that is also, to do that, we can't assert ourselves as the high priests. We're the ones who hold truth. And I think as science communicators, we have to think about sharing that space with others who communicate differently and have different ways of understanding, so that we ourselves recognize the limits of what I know about this chemical versus what this person's lived experience is with that chemical, like this sort of thing.
Okay. Virginia? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I'll throw my favorite article on this in the chat box, so just in case you're bored.
Okay.
Hi, I'm a practicing engineer, been out of the UW for 20 years, and just really appreciate your talk today. I guess the thing that you reminded me of the most is proximity. If you're in close proximity to low-income people, disenfranchised people, you learn what needs to be done. And the other thing that they say a lot in the Poor People's Campaign is, if you want to change the narrative, change the narrator. And so they're like giving voice to a lot of people. So I think there's lots of community activities going on. And I also really liked what you said about, you know, where does knowledge come from? I live with somebody who has no college education, who spent 25 years in prison. And my knowledge with 3 bachelor's degrees and his knowledge with street smarts, you know, you really explained, you know, what our problem is knowledge comes from different places, and we have to respect the different places it comes from, because this person I live with is sort of a security person, and they stand in front of a building and try to talk to homeless people who are strung out on drugs, and he has all these ideas about what to do. But so I just really appreciate what you're saying. And then I was also going to say that the University of Washington has a global disaster certification program, and so I'm just wondering if, you know, there's somebody in that program that can work with engineering to maybe, you know, start talking about this kind of class, because it's all related. I love the thing about there's no such thing as a natural disaster. So I think that's all I have to say. Anyway, thank you so much.
I'm going to leave that to the UW folks on here to figure out. I'm happy to contribute though.
Let's see, Craig, do you want to ask your question? Sorry, it's hard to scroll through everything.
Good. Khalid, I appreciate your talk. It was really good. I think it was on point in a lot of ways. One question I do have, are you familiar with Sobrani Park at all in that neighborhood?
Yeah, a little bit. Not super familiar, but a little bit, yeah.
There's a creek remediation project that's happening behind. It's, you know, happening through Merritt College, all that good stuff. And they have like $10 million to spend in this community. However, you know, it's an interesting process because there is community input, but there's not a whole lot of foresight into like what the possible unintended consequences are of this. You know, you inject $10 million into infrastructure, you know, you solve a lot of these, you know, problems, right? But then that raises property values and then, you know, expedites the process of gentrification, right? And then, so how do you control for that? You know, you're an engineer, but there's social problems that are not being addressed in conjunction with the engineering problems that you're addressing.
I would say 2 things I want to say. I think that's a beautiful example, and I really appreciate you bringing that example forward. I would say 2 things. The first is that the example you're giving demonstrates the reason why we have to think in systems. Because if you're just improving the neighborhood, what you're doing is displacing the people who live in the neighborhood. So you're not actually improving their lives. Their lives are going to actually get worse because they're going to be displaced. And you're improving the physical space so that someone else can live there. So I use this sort of example of like, if there's a slum community living on toxic soil, and you go in and remediate that soil, that land's going to become really valuable. And guess what? They're going to be pushed out immediately. So their lives are going to just be constantly on the move to the next worst place. And you just made that land valuable for someone to make a profit off of. So there's a real need to think about systems and to engage systemically in these things. I would say that if you're an engineer working on those kinds of projects, you have to be in the land tenure housing conversation. And you have to start figuring out who has tenure in this space and who is safe if we fix this, and what would it take to make other people safe as we're doing this project. I think that's sticky because the housing conversation feels like a totally different discipline and a totally different set of things, but this gets at how these two things are interwoven into one another. So I really appreciate that question.
I appreciate your time.
Okay, were there other questions from, sorry, I'm trying to look at the chat and video screens. Anyone else have a question for Khalid?
I'm perusing the chat box. I think I see one about what are some other ways we can start gaining knowledge or start to think about gaining knowledge in a different way. I think that's a struggle that I personally wondered about a lot. Like how do we get access to this other ways of thinking, other ways of knowing? So there's a few things that come to mind. First, if you're in a university environment, the first easiest step is to start taking courses outside of your discipline. Like I took tons of courses outside of engineering. At one point, my advisor was really mad at me because I was taking too many classes and not in the lab enough. But then I started hiding it and kept doing it. And she was ultimately very supportive. But like, it was sort of this process of like, I realized I had so much to learn from geographers and planners and sociologists and anthropologists. And that was deeply related to what I was doing. Not just sort of intellectual fun thing over there, but it was deeply connected. And so that was the first step. And that just broadened my understanding that there were other ways of knowing, and I personally was very interested in methods, because that's like, well, how do you know that? Where have you come to that conclusion? And understanding the methods that other disciplines use and what are the standards for truth in those disciplines was really important to me to help understand that different knowledge. The other is just getting off of campus and getting out of our communities and getting into spaces where we have this tendency to live in bubbles. We live in a neighborhood with people that talk like us, that think like us, that have jobs with similar salaries because they can also afford to be in that neighborhood. Like there is this sort of bubble effect if we're not careful. And so how do we think proactively about making sure our own lives are filled with diverse perspectives, and what might we do to listen to other people? The other piece of this is I really think that while I am like reading is so important to me, as I'm sure it is to everyone here, I think it takes a certain level of privilege to end up putting something down into a book, right? And not only that, but it takes a certain understanding that books are where knowledge is recorded. And that's not a universal idea. That's a very Western idea. So like the idea that knowledge lies in books is different than the idea that knowledge lies in people. And what I'm getting at is the more we can spend time with people, I think spend time with elders and learn from them in other communities, I think we can learn enormous amounts from them. And that's like make dinner for people and visit them and sit with them and listen to them and be patient with them. I think that's a way you can get other kinds of knowledge that's not extractive. That's not like I'm coming to get something from you and walk away, but I'm coming to sort of learn how you understand the world.
This is kind of a follow-up question to that by Eli. It's, we, especially in, a more traditional view is that you should stick to your own area of expertise and not kind of expand outwards beyond your, competency level. Even, in getting back to Carson's question about science communication, not issuing public statements that are, that are only done in an objective and truthful manner. So what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think like truthful statements are always contingent. Like that bridge is strong enough to hold this. given this, that, and the other that I based in my calculations and my safety factor and my understandings about the tensile strength of that steel rebar in there, whatever it is, right? So like, that's always like implied, I think, when we say those things, but that's back to that, like you mentioned, Khalid, that science communication piece about inviting people into the mess a little bit. And I think, and this is my own perspective on one of the reasons why we're having such struggle around climate change in the United States is because there's like mistrust or distrust in science. There's also the whole merchants of doubt thing happening. But like, to the extent that we have kept science exclusive, we've engendered that mistrust. We've invited that we haven't invited people to understand what it is we do. And so I think we can do better than that. And so I think being careful to not assert ourselves as experts and truth sayers, and to bring forward the sort of the contingent nature of the statements we make, as opposed to speaking absolute truth, to invite folks into the contingent nature of the truths we speak, is how I think about that.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. The first comes from Adi. Could you elaborate on challenging the means in which knowledge is created within engineering? What are some other ways we can engage in the scientific process while recognizing how the scientific process informs our own personal biases?
To do that, I would lean on a lot of what public health folks have done, and Jason Coburn has a great book, Citizen Science, Street Science, but also looking at the citizen science efforts to think about how community knowledge and scientific knowledge need not be in any sort of competition with each other, but can be mutually beneficial, and how working with communities around the issues that they deem important in bringing their understandings forward in a serious way, not in sort of a patronizing way, can actually make our science better. So there is that argument as well, let alone the justice-based argument about who gets to decide, who gets to speak about whom, for whom, that sort of thing. So I think that these need not be in competition with one another. I just think it requires us to engage in listening, really. It's really a listening project at the root of it, as opposed to an asserting project.
Great, thanks. Lauren, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I've been thinking about what you said about viewing climate change as a symptom of that systemic injustice and supremacy. And I'm sort of looking back on all the other seminars we've listened to this quarter, and just all of the other education that I've had and talks I've listened to. The whole conversation, at least in the US, seems to be about managing the symptoms of climate change and, you know, managing carbon output, but viewing it as a symptom of greater injustice, and recognizing that there are other things that a lot of the most polluting corporations have done to harm vulnerable populations of people. It seems like managing carbon emissions as a way to fight climate change is almost like locking in that injustice. And I'm wondering if you've done anything sort of more like policy decisions rather than just teaching. Not that you haven't done enough, you've done so much. This is such an awesome actually done, but I do want to hear your thoughts on it.
I appreciate that. No, totally. And I think that's I love how you frame that. Like, it's a really straightforward point that you're making. And I think that I haven't been involved in a lot of policy work myself. I keep thinking about diving into that space more, but that's a whole world in itself, how policymaking happens. But I think that the approach to tackling symptoms, like we do need to deal with symptoms. There's no question about it. But it's the tackling symptoms in ways that reproduce problems is a problem, and not allowing ourselves the creative space to think about approaching systems and structures they need not be in competition with one another. we can tackle structures while tackling symptoms. And I think that's where creative solutions can really come forward. Like, how can we deal with carbon emissions in the atmosphere while also undermining the process that leads to those carbon emissions in the first place? And I think we can do that, but we can't do it if we don't understand the system that's creating the carbon emissions in the first place. So that's where I think that, like, we can do symptom related work, but I think we'll do better and we'll also have the possibility of doing structural work if we recognize and we are constantly thinking about, okay, how can I also tackle the structure in the process of engaging with this symptom? And to me, that's more fun. It's just open space for more creative work.
Thank you.
All right. Is there like one more quick question before we all thank Khalid? Speak now. Nope. Oh, nope. Okay. Wait, was there
Maybe.
someone? I heard something. Oh, Alex, yeah.
Thanks for that talk. That was awesome, and I really enjoyed it. I'm currently teaching undergraduate fluid mechanics. I've said control volume about 100 times this week, and many of the students in my class are on this call and in the thick of doing a problem set on momentum conservation in control volumes. So before I call them up and tell them to cancel that, can you tell me then how you think, what in sort of the way you'd love to see engineering done, how do you frame sort of these classical concepts in engineering, and what's their importance, and how do they fit into that? How do you want people to think about those, what we thought of as these sort of apolitical box, simple box things that aren't anymore?
That's like the like $64 million question, right? Like, I totally am with you. Don't have the answer for sure. However, I'll say two things. One, that process thing, like let's agree on our understanding of what some of the problems are, and then put our creative energies collectively to thinking about that. That's the first thing. The other is, one example that I'll bring forward is Kurt Patterson's work at James Madison University. They have an undergraduate engineering degree that's a liberal arts degree. And I keep showing that one because it's the one I'm familiar with. But like the way they approach this is, I think most of their undergraduate classes are very much like design oriented, and they have to deal with specific problems where, and it takes them, pedagogically, it's a lot more work to make sure we can come up with like, okay, we're gonna deal with this problem in this local stream. And in that, I have to make sure that you learn how momentum works and these sorts of things. Now that it's fun, but it is more work. It's a lot easier to pull these things out of a textbook. So that's where I'm like, we need to support faculty if we're gonna ask them to do this and give them the space to do it. But I think that like, if you find momentum relevant to the world, well, show me where it's relevant, and then let's teach the class based on that, And so, and I would think it's relevant, yes, certainly. And I would say like, there's a lot of work done on this in another field, in mathematics education, because there's a lot of questions about math education and justice and equity, and how do we make these real, and they're trying to teach addition and subtraction and long division. How do we make that? And I think if they can do it there, we can definitely do it in our classes, so.
Okay, one more quick question. What have you learned most from teaching your courses?
The canned response to that one is how little I know, but it's really, I mean, it totally is true. Like the speed at which ideas people are running with ideas, and the speed at which I'm learning. Like, I think, you invite me here to talk about this because you think I know something about this, but I like turn around and I'm like, wow, I'm a fraud. Look at these folks who know so much more than me. Like, there's some of that happens. And I feel like I'm very much like in between worlds in many ways in my career. Like, on one hand, I'm an engineer. I have a PhD in environmental engineering, but on the other hand, I'm teaching political economy and poverty and critical theory, and like institutions don't know how to make sense of me. Like, and so like, where do I fit, and how do they find a home for me has always been like a funny challenge. And I feel like I've learned, like, and as a result of that, like, Alex knows fluids better than I do, and he always will, right? And the sociologist is going to know social theory better than me. So I have this sort of in-between space that I exist in, and I think I've learned to see all the things that I don't know as a result of that. So.
All right. With that, I want to say thank you again, Khalid, so much. I feel like after the last 3 days or so, you don't know how much I needed this.
Right.
So thank you for that. Thank you, Steve and Sylvia, for enabling this fantastic discussion. And thank you all for sticking around on hopefully I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but good luck to all of us. And thank you all for coming to this talk. This is so amazing. Thank you, Khalid, so much.
It's been super fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Khalid. That was a wonderful talk. I feel like it engaged me at all these different levels, from being an educator, teaching my own classes, to being a department chair, part of the UW, part of Seattle. It was really interesting. Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.
Love it. Love it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone. Be safe.